I walked into the largest mosque in Kuala Lumpur every single Friday for 11 years and sang a worship song that I believed was lifting my soul closer to Allah. But the night my heart stopped on an operating table and I stood face to face with Jesus Christ Himself, He played that exact song back to me and showed me, word by word, line by line, that every lyric I had poured my heart into was actually praising the devil. And when the truth of what I had been singing hit me, I collapsed in a place beyond this world and wept harder than I have ever wept in my entire life. Have you ever been so certain that the words coming out of your mouth were reaching God that you never once thought to ask who was really listening on the other end? My name is Khalid Amir Al-Rashidi. I am 30 years old, and on November 14th, 2021, my heart stopped for 3 minutes and 51 seconds during emergency surgery at Gleneagles Hospital in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I was pronounced clinically dead, and in those 3 minutes and 51 seconds, Jesus Christ revealed a deception so deep that it destroyed everything I had built my faith on. I had no idea that the worship I gave my entire life to was never reaching the God I thought I was singing to. I grew up in the Kampung Baru neighborhood of Kuala Lumpur, in a modest wooden house that sat so close to the Masjid Jamek Mosque that the call to prayer did not just wake me every morning. It shook the glass in my bedroom window. My father, Imam Amir Yusuf Al-Rashidi, was one of the most respected religious scholars in our district. He led Friday prayers for a congregation of over 800 men. His voice was deep and steady, and when he recited the Quran, grown men wept. My mother Salima wore hijab from the age of 9 and ran Quran study circles for women in our neighborhood 3 days a week. She could recite 42 surahs from memory, and she made sure I could do the same before I turned 10. Our home smelled like cardamom tea and sandalwood incense, and the sound of Quranic recitation played from a small speaker on the kitchen counter from the moment we woke until the moment we slept. Islam was not a religion in our family, it was the oxygen. While other boys in Kampung Baru played sepak takraw in the alley or rode their bikes to the river, I sat on the floor of my father's study and memorized the Quran, verse by verse. By the time I was 15, I had memorized the entire holy book, every word, every pause. My father gathered the elders of the mosque and they placed their hands on my shoulders and said, "Allah has blessed your parents with a special son." I never missed a single prayer, not once. Not when I was sick with dengue fever and could barely stand. Not when I traveled to Jakarta for my cousin's wedding and the hotel had no prayer room. I fasted every day of Ramadan without a single complaint, and I added voluntary fasts on Mondays and Thursdays because my father told me that the Prophet loved those who gave more than what was asked. I had no idea that this devotion, this absolute sincerity, was being directed somewhere I could not have imagined. My father taught me from my earliest years that Christians were misguided at best and dangerous at worst. He said they worshipped a man as God, which was shirk, the one sin that could never be forgiven. He told me their Bible had been corrupted centuries ago and that their churches were houses of confusion. In our neighborhood, it was common for boys to shout insults at the small group of Chinese Christians who gathered in a shop house down the road every Sunday. Nobody stopped us. By the time I was 18, I had joined a campus Dawah group at the University of Malaya that focused on debating and discrediting Christian students. We held public events, we distributed pamphlets explaining why the Trinity was an impossible contradiction. We stood outside church buildings during Easter and handed out leaflets explaining why the crucifixion was a lie. I felt righteous every single time. By 27, I had completed my degree in civil engineering and joined one of the most prestigious construction firms in the city. I was engaged to a beautiful woman named Noor Aisha, the daughter of a prominent businessman who prayed at my father's mosque. She wore her hijab with elegance and could recite hadith with the confidence of a scholar. We were planning a grand wedding at the Masjid Nigara. I had everything: the career, the respect, the faith, the future wife. My life was complete. Ask yourself this question: have you ever built your entire life on something you were absolutely certain would never break? The nasheed that would become the center of my story was called Ruhul Sama, meaning Spirit of the Heavens. It was a beloved worship song that had been sung in mosques across Southeast Asia for over 20 years. The melody was slow and haunting and deeply emotional. When 800 men sang it together after Friday prayers, the sound filled the entire mosque and spilled out into the streets. I had memorized every word by the time I was 12. I sang it with tears running down my face more times than I can count. It made me feel closer to God than any prayer I ever prayed. I believed with my whole heart that every note was rising straight to the throne of Allah. I had no idea that the song I loved most, the song that defined my worship for over a decade, contained phrases and invocations that were never meant for the Creator at all. The surgery was not supposed to be dangerous. I had torn the ligament in my right knee during a construction site visit, and the doctors at Gleneagles Hospital scheduled a routine arthroscopic repair. I kissed Noor Aisha's hand in the waiting room and told her I would see her in 2 hours. She smiled and opened her Quran to read while she waited. The anesthesiologist told me to count backward from 10. I reached 6. Then something went wrong. My heart stopped. The monitors flatlined. I learned later that the surgical team performed emergency resuscitation for 3 minutes and 51 seconds. They shocked my chest 4 times before they got a pulse. But during those 3 minutes, I was not in that operating room. I was somewhere else entirely. And what happened next changed everything. The first thing I felt was silence. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of a place where sound has never existed and never needed to. I was standing in a space that had no edges, no ceiling, no walls. The ground beneath me was solid, but I could not see it. Everything was bathed in light, but not the light of the sun or a lamp. This light was alive. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat. It was warm against my skin, not hot, but warm the way a mother's hand feels on your forehead when you are a child. The air smelled like something I cannot name. The closest I can describe is night blooming jasmine mixed with rain falling on clean stone, but even that is only a shadow of what I experienced. I looked at my own hands and they were translucent. I could see the light passing through them, and I was not afraid. For the first time in my 30 years of life, I felt absolutely no fear. I had no idea that I was standing in the presence of the one I had spent my entire life being taught to reject. He appeared the way the dawn appears, not sudden, not startling. He was simply there, and it felt as if he had always been there and I had simply been unable to see him until that moment. He was tall. His robes were white, but not the white of cloth, the white of pure light pressed into the shape of fabric. His face was the most beautiful and most terrifying thing I have ever looked upon. It held infinite kindness and infinite authority at the same time. His eyes looked directly into mine, and I knew with a certainty deeper than anything I had ever felt during any prayer or any fast or any recitation, that this was Jesus. Not Isa the prophet, not a figure from a corrupted book, Jesus, the Son of the living God. And he knew me. He knew my name. He knew every prayer I had ever whispered. He knew every song I had ever sung. That is when it happened. The moment that shattered everything I believed about worship, about music, about the very words I had offered to heaven for 11 years. Jesus opened his hands, and from his palms the melody began to play. I recognized it instantly. Ruh al-Sama, my song, the song I had sung 1,000 times, the song that made me weep with love for God. But now I heard it differently. It was as if Jesus had peeled back the surface of the music and revealed something underneath that had been hidden the entire time. Each word appeared before me, not as text, but as living shapes of light and shadow. The opening line, which I had always understood as a cry to the Lord of the heavens, was shown to me in its original form. Jesus traced it back through centuries, through layers of translation and adaptation to its source. And the source was not a prayer to the Creator. It was an ancient invocation to a fallen being, a being of light who was not light at all. The second verse, which spoke of surrender and ecstasy, used a melodic structure that Jesus showed me had been deliberately crafted to open the spirit to something other than God. Not every word was corrupt. That was what made it so devastating. The truth was woven between the lies so tightly that no human ear could have separated them. But Jesus separated them for me, line by line, note by note. And with each revelation, I felt something inside me tearing apart. My knees buckled. I collapsed in that place of light and I wept. I cried harder than I had ever cried in my life. Tears streamed down my face faster than I could wipe them away. I was not crying because I was sad. I was crying because I understood. Every Friday for 11 years, every tear I had shed singing that song, every moment I thought I was touching the face of God, it had been intercepted, redirected, stolen. The worship of my heart had been hijacked, and I had never known. I could feel heat radiating from Jesus, wave after wave of love so powerful it was almost unbearable. He was not angry with me. That was the part that broke me the most. He was grieving with me. He said, not with sound but with words that arrived fully formed inside my mind, "Khalid, I have heard every cry of your heart. I have loved you since before your father spoke your name. But the words they gave you were never meant for me. They were stolen. Let me give you a new song." And in that moment, he opened his hands wider, and a melody poured out that was unlike anything I had ever heard in any mosque, any concert, any recording on earth. It was pure worship. Every note pointed to him. Every word carried truth. I understood then that real worship is not about tradition or repetition or beautiful melody. Real worship is about who receives it. Ask yourself this question. How do you explain standing before the living God when everything you were taught told you he was only a prophet? The doctors pulled me back. The first breath I took in that operating room felt like swallowing broken glass after the air I had been breathing in that place. The fluorescent lights were gray and harsh. A nurse was shouting my name. I grabbed the surgeon's wrist and said through sobs, "I saw him. I saw Jesus. The song is wrong. The song was never for God." They thought I was confused from the anesthesia. They gave me a sedative. When I woke up 8 hours later in a recovery room, the first words I said to the nurse were, "I need to find someone who follows Jesus." It took me 2 weeks. A Christian colleague at my firm, a quiet Indian man named Samuel, whom I had ignored for years, saw the change in me. He asked me what was wrong. I told him everything. He listened without blinking. Then he took me to a small gathering at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in the Brickfields neighborhood. There were only about 30 people there that Wednesday evening. A pastor named Reverend David Chen listened to my story. When I finished, he knelt in front of me and said, "He loves you, son. He has been waiting for you." That night, I prayed the first true prayer of my life. I said, "Jesus, I have been wrong about you my whole life. I sang songs that were not for you. I gave my worship to something I did not understand. but I saw you. I know you are real. Forgive me. Save me. I surrender everything to you." The room erupted in quiet tears and joyful whispers. These strangers wrapped their arms around me like I was their brother. Samuel wept beside me. I had no idea that the cost of this surrender would nearly destroy every earthly thing I had. Reverend Chen baptized me 2 months later in that same church. I chose the name David because David was a man who wrote songs of true worship to the true God, and that was what I wanted my life to become. That is when everything I believed was shattered, not by Jesus, but by the people I loved most. I told my father on a Tuesday evening. I sat across from him in his study, the same room where I had memorized the Quran as a boy, and I told him what I saw during those 3 minutes and 51 seconds. I told him about the light, the face of Jesus, the song. He did not move. He did not blink. When I finished, the silence lasted so long that I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Then he stood. His voice was cold and steady as a blade when he spoke. "You are no longer my son. You are dead to us. Leave this house and never return." My mother was standing in the doorway. She had heard everything. She slid down the wall and cried like I had actually died. The sound of her grief will haunt me until my last breath. She sent me one text message 3 days later. It said, "How could you do this to us?" Then she blocked my number. Noor Aisha returned the engagement ring through her brother. She did not come herself. Her brother called me a murtad, an apostate, and told me I was cursed by Allah. Within 10 days, I was terminated from my position at the firm. My landlord told me I had 1 week to leave. My phone filled with messages from cousins and uncles and childhood friends, some threatening, some grieving, all final. The community held funeral prayers for me at my father's mosque. The imam who led those prayers was my own father. He buried me while I was still breathing. I fled Malaysia within 6 weeks. I had no idea that the God who showed me the truth about a song would also show me the truth about what love costs. But I gained everything that truly matters. I gained Jesus Christ. I gained a forgiveness so complete that not a single one of my sins remained. I gained peace that did not depend on career or community or the approval of men. I gained eternal life, not as a concept in a book, but as a promise from the God who stood before me and called me by name. I settled in Melbourne, Australia, where a Christian refugee organization helped me find work and housing. It was at St. Paul's Cathedral in the city center that I met a woman named Hannah. She was a worship leader with dark curly hair and a laugh that filled every room she entered. She had grown up in a Lebanese Christian family, and she understood what it meant to carry the weight of 2 worlds. We married 9 months later at St. Andrew's, the very church where I had been baptized. Reverend Chen officiated. Samuel stood beside me as my best man. I now share my testimony through a ministry that reaches Muslims across Southeast Asia and the Middle East through secure online platforms. Over 83 Muslims have accepted Jesus Christ after hearing what happened to me during those 3 minutes and 51 seconds. Some of them knew the same nasheed. Some of them wept when I described what Jesus showed me about its true origin. I returned to St. Andrew's on the first anniversary of my baptism and stood before the congregation and sang. Not the old song, a new song. The one Jesus placed inside me in that place of light. I still write letters to my parents twice a year. I write them in Malay and in Arabic. I tell them I love them. I tell them about Hannah and about our son Adam, whose name means earth, because Jesus formed him from dust and breathed life into him, just as he breathed new life into me. No letter has ever been answered. I do not know if my mother reads them or if my father burns them before she can. but I send them because Jesus taught me that love does not stop when it is not returned. The first song my son ever heard was not the Islamic call to prayer. It was a hymn about Jesus sung softly by his mother in our kitchen at dawn. The Hafiz who memorized the Quran by 15 and sang praises to the wrong God every Friday for 11 years no longer exists. In his place stands a follower of Jesus Christ who would rather die than let a single false word of worship leave his mouth again. Look inside your own heart right now. If he can transform someone like me, someone who poured a decade of sincere worship into a song that was intercepted by the enemy before it ever reached heaven, then he can absolutely transform you. No matter what you have done or where you come from, no matter what songs you have sung or what prayers you have repeated without knowing who was truly receiving them on the other side. The same Jesus who stood before me in that place of impossible light and gently, lovingly exposed the deepest deception of my life is standing before you right now through this very testimony. He is offering you the same love, the same forgiveness, the same truth that changed everything for me. Jesus is calling you right now. Do not wait for your heart to stop on an operating table. Do not wait for 3 minutes of death to meet him. He is already pursuing you. He has been pursuing you since before you press play on this video. Will you let him in and finally discover whose name the true song of heaven carries?